Your blood comes from dukes and great houses. We don't have that here. Here, we're equal. Men and women alike. What we do for the benefit of all.
Well, I'd very much like to be equal to you.
Maybe I'll show you the way.
Dune Part 2. I remember at the end of Dune Part 1, which you really, really liked.
Yes, very much.
You love very much. And you said, well, they've left a lot of work.
I said they have a mountain to climb because if you know the story of Dune, and it was lovely hearing about them talking about him saying I read it as a teenager as my favourite book, and then then he sidles up and goes, "Have you ever read Dune?" And it's not a casual question; it's just like, "Oh, did you see that that thing on the?"
If Denis Villeneuve asks you that kind of question, it means something.
Here we go.
Yeah.
And as I was saying before, obviously the history of Dune, there is a very good documentary called Jodorowsky's Dune, which is all about how the Jodorowsky Dune, which was going to be 14 hours long and star Salvador Dali as a robot, as far as I understand, or a robot of Salvador Dali in order to make it work, never got made. And then, of course, David Lynch made his version, which doesn't make any sense and then exists in two different, anyway, whatever. So the idea that the first Dune worked as well as it did was great, but the story, the first half of the story is kind of, it's got fairly clear lines, somebody coming in. And it was very interesting that Denis Villeneuve said in that interview, it was like Timothée Chalamet between the two films, but, kind of comes of age, which of course is the story of Paul
Becomes a leading
Atreides.
man.
But the second half is a lot darker. It's a lot more complex. It's a lot more complicated. And it's interesting that that's probably where the wheels come off in the David Lynch version. So, firstly, you do have to have seen Dune Part 1. There's no excuse for not seeing Dune Part 1. It's widely available on streaming services.
It's on Netflix. Just watch it.
If you're going to see Dune Part 2, see Dune Part 1. And I know that in that interview, Denis Villeneuve said, well, we had to make it so that there was kind of like a recap at the beginning for anyone who hadn't seen the first one. That recap isn't going to explain anything at all.
It's not a long scroll like in Star Wars.
No, it's one of those things like, if you remember previously on Twin Peaks, which seemed to be there specifically to confuse the audience. Even if you understood what was going on, once you'd seen the previously on Twin Peaks, you thought, I've got no idea. Lynch's version had a visual splendor, but it was, in the end, thematically empty. It was a film of very memorable interludes, but it didn't have a through line. And what Villeneuve's Dune proved was that you can do this. But it's very, very complicated to keep these. There is so many things going on, particularly in the second part. It takes a real storytelling clarity. Now, part 1 had a real clarity to it. I think what is really impressive about part 2 is that despite how complex and, like a miasma the plot becomes, Denis Villeneuve, who, as he demonstrated in Arrival, I think one of the reasons that you love Arrival so much, and it's the same reason I do, is the storytelling is so clear. It's a really interesting story about how you view time, whether you view time as linear or cyclical, and it's how temporality affects your view of fate and of life and death, which sounds like it's completely, and yet when you watch Arrival, it's a really beautiful story. And I think the same is true of Blade Runner 2049.
2049.
I'm so sorry, Blade Runner 2049, which I think Martin Scorsese enjoyed as well. So the thing with this is, like you said, it is beautiful. But like both Arrival and Blade Runner 2049, the visual beauty never obscures what's going on underneath. Sci-fi is a genre in which ideas and wonderment coincide. And sometimes science fiction on screen can just succumb to spectacle. I remember Stephen King saying that there are various levels of horror. And I think it's like, terror, horror, gross out. So it's like you aim for one, and in science fiction, it's like ideas are at the top, and at the bottom, it's a planet blowing up. So if nothing else works, I'll give you a planet, or I'll give you a monster, or something like that. This has ravishing dunes. I mean, people were talking about this. So yeah, they filmed on location. What? In space? No, on location in sand dunes. The worms are breathtaking. I mean, the idea of the worms is so hard to visualize when you read the books to find, but the worms are absolutely breathtaking. If you've seen the trailers, there's that shot of them coming to, just coming out of the thing. They are breathtaking, and the worm riding is breathtaking as well. You actually think that you are watching somebody
Riding a worm.
Riding a giant worm, which is, you know, this has gladiatorial fights to the death, but none of that spectacle ever obscures the fact that the story is what's important. Greg Fraser, who shot Dune and Batman and Creator, has talked about this technique that he uses, which is that the whole thing's shot in IMAX, but it's you shoot digital. You shoot on IMAX-approved digital cameras, and then you transfer to 35mm and then back. And people say, well, why? And I read an interview with him, and he said, well, when we were doing the tests, film looked too nostalgic and digital looked too crisp. So using this process gives us the best of both worlds. And okay, it's up to cinematographers to tell me whether there's an easier way of doing this. But what I know is that the end result looks really, really breathtaking. I think when you were talking about the Space Jesus, which is what Child 3 refers to...
Child 1.
Child 1, I beg your pardon.
Space Jesus.
Space Jesus.
Which it does sound as though part 3 is definitely going to be Space Jesus.
But it's also, and I don't mean this as a mocking thing, I mean it genuinely, it is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Because not Monty Python, but Monty Python's Life of Brian. Because one of the things that's fascinating about it is that as Denis Villeneuve was saying, the dogma becoming, bigger than the message, and then the message turns into warfare. If you remember the sequence in Life of Brian, when the crowd chase Brian, and one of his shoes falls off, and John Cleese, he has left us a sign, it is a shoe, and then somebody else says, no, he's left us the gourd, we must follow the gourd, and suddenly all these this plethora of ideas come out, and he's doing all the time, I'm not the Messiah. And there is a kind of I'm not the Messiah element to the Paul Atreides character, which is then sort of overwhelmed by what we are told is predestined fate. And there's a lot of very complicated philosophical stuff here about the idea of prophecy, and prophecies being stories, and prophecies being stories that are used to control people. And actually, in the context of something we were talking about earlier on about any kind of religious fundamentalism and the way in which those ideas can be poisonous, this is a really kind of deep, dark dive descent into all of those things with giant space worms, ornithopters, gladiatorial battles. There's one shootout sequence which is really properly nail-biting stuff. Also, in terms of the music, I was told recently, apparently the bagpipes in that first film, they're not bagpipes.
Aren't they?
Well, you can see a bagpipe on screen,
Yeah,
but
you do.
apparently Hans Zimmer did it with electric guitar, much like Big Country did when they were in a big country. But anyway, so brilliant to hear that part 3 is happening, which is Dune Messiah, which Space Jesus, as you're calling it. And I think that this does have the potential to be like a triptych, like the first 3 Star Wars movies, which people kind of take as a sort of, the holy trinity of the Star Wars stuff. I really like because what happened with the next book is that Herbert was saying that it's about the consequences of what happens. And Denis Villeneuve talking about, it's a tragic idea, the messianic tragic idea, and we are I think we're definitely set up for that. But I'm just so impressed that he's managed to keep all those really quite complicated themes going whilst having all this extraordinary visual spectacle, whilst having moments when you're just looking at it and thinking, I've been transported to another world. And I would say see it in the biggest format you can.
Did you feel that Christopher Walken and Florence Pugh were kind of underused?
Here is my PS. I think the performances are very good. I think Zendaya is terrific. I think she's really she actually is the kind of the center of the drama, and this is a big weight to carry because this is a very, very complicated film. I think she's really, really great. And Austin Butler, I didn't recognize Austin Butler as Sting. I didn't recognize Austin Butler initially. It was like, oh wow, it's Elvis.
I think you're not supposed to know.
No, but it
could be anybody.
But that's great. However, and also, I'm not the biggest fan of Timothée Chalamet, but I spent the whole movie not thinking of him as Timothée Chalamet, thinking of him as Paul Atreides. My one quibble would be Christopher Walken plays Christopher Walken. And you do expect him at one point to tell Timothée Chalamet that he's got the watch that his father put up his jacksie, because he's doing Christopher Walken. Even the Christopher Walken hair in space is Christopher Walken hair. And I think Christopher Walken's great. I think he's really, really good. But there was something weird about that role. I never thought that was anything other than Christopher Walken wearing a costume. And I have this feeling that if you said to Christopher Walken, So, Christopher, tell us about the background to this story. He wouldn't have known anything other than what he was saying. Now, I may be wrong. But on screen, I think it is the one jarring note that he appears to have been parachuted in from outside. And of course, it's why not cast Christopher Walken? He's great in everything. I think he isn't great in this. And your other point was that you think that
inevitably, because he and Florence Pugh are connected. They come together. That it feels as though they're underused.
Yeah,
you go through the whole of the first film thinking, okay, it was Stellan Skarsgård. He's clearly the bad guy, and then you get to Dune 2, you go, oh, well, he's not the main bad guy because there's another bad guy behind him.
Yes, although I think the difference would be that I think that Florence Pugh is great for the amount that she is used, and I think that Christopher Walken isn't. I think he's not very good in it. And that is a minor quibble in the worms, the sand, the politics, the religion, the everything else, the music, the whole experience. My one quibble is Christopher Walken talking.
Very good. I like that.